Okay, we're all here. Hey, everybody. Welcome this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a special kind of webinar this evening that Fit is putting on. Fit is software for sports performance practitioners. And we have an awesome guest this evening. Tim Kettenring is calling us from the New Orleans area and we're very excited to have him. I'm excited to kind of get a look at his have him share his expertise with us. And Tim, I was wondering before I start, we're actually all ready to rock and roll. But would you mind just giving a little background on um, your experience, your education, the businesses that you have started, and maybe some of the cool things that you're involved in a lot of things that you have going on. So we'd love to just get a picture of you before we jump into the presentation, and then we'll let you share your screen after that, and we'll begin. I'm just going to start recording right now. Okay, we're good. Awesome, Tim. It's all yours.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Landon. And for those of you who don't know me, my name's Tim Kettenring, and I am my primary role is as the head of S&C high performance director of NOLA Gold Rugby. And I also own a business called Maverick Human Performance, where I do some consulting, some coaching, both in person, remote, and a lot of coach education. And I'm primarily kind of known in the profession as the conditioning guy. But and obviously like, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But I'm also quite a bit deeper than that. For those of you who have followed me for a while, though, I see that yeah, got a handful of friends on here, so it's always good to see familiar names, even if we don't necessarily see familiar faces. I've been in strength and conditioning for going on 16 years now. That'll going into my 17th year in January of 25. And I've worked at every level and in every setting, um, from high school to Division I university to small university, to the professional level, obviously now in Major League Rugby. I've also spent time in the private sector in large facilities working with NFL and Major League Baseball athletes, as well as middle school and high school athletes and everything in between. And now I also have a small training facility here in New Orleans where I have a handful of kind of specialized clients, usually kind of like post rehab, is where I specialize there. Um, and obviously, like tonight, we're going to talk a lot about energy system development, which I know is not the most exciting topic, but I'm going to try to make it as engaging and informative, as well as kind of somewhat maybe give you some new perspectives, kind of around conditioning and ESD, so that hopefully you all can take away 2 to 3 things and turn around and implement them. On Monday morning, uh, if you're in a coaching setting, and if you're not, hopefully there's still something that you can take away, maybe apply to your own training. So cover all the bases there. Cool. All right, so go ahead and share my screen here. So assuming everybody can see that. So the title of this, kind of like my standby presentation here, is called "The C is for Conditioning," and obviously it's kind of a little bit of a play on words, because as the profession is strength and conditioning, there's obviously like a ton of emphasis on speed, strength, and power, and justifiably so. There's very little emphasis on conditioning, though. And what I kind of want you all to, from maybe the primary takeaway from this webinar, is that like conditioning supports everything that we do from a speed, strength, and power standpoint. And especially like even just like from a fundamental biological perspective, all of our energy systems support everything we do in all other parts of training and competition. Some things that we'll talk about, we're going to look at like the physiological principles that underpin conditioning, and then maybe check some boxes on some methods that are mostly familiar, I would imagine, for most of you. And then we'll talk a little bit about program design. So starting from a principle standpoint, and the reason that I think this is important, first of all, is that like if you scroll through any social media, whether it's Twitter or Instagram, you're going to see a lot of coaches sharing information and sharing content. And I think that's great. But a lot of it is lacking context, and even more of it is lacking a principle base. It's a lot heavily focused on trends, heavily focused on methods, but very little of it is principle based. And the same thing goes for continuing education. I was at a clinic this weekend, and of the eight speakers, six of them were either talking about a method or a trend, and then no one was talking about anything from a principle standpoint. I think it's taken for granted that like if you are in the profession that you have these bases covered from a principle standpoint. Um, but I think it's kind of irresponsible. So like we're gonna talk about principles first. And kind of the two principles that I want to talk about first are the ideas of capacity and power. So, regardless of like which of the three energy systems we're addressing, either from a training standpoint or from a programming standpoint, we're either going to be addressing the capacity component or we're going to be addressing the power component. And capacity, all it is just the maximum duration of a system's operation during which it remains predominant. So, you know, this is kind of the time range at which any energy system is active, right? Power is going to be the time interval during which the maximum intensity of energy production by a single system is predominant. So um, power functions within the parameters of capacity. And from a training standpoint, capacity is going to support like the repeatability of outputs. So regardless of whether that output is 2 or 3 seconds or 2 or 3 minutes, the recovery and regeneration that takes place between those outputs is going to be supported by that capacity component. Um, and then as far as just like why we do energy system development work to begin with is that like we want to see as little of a drop off in speed and power over the course of a practice or a training session or a competition over that period of time as possible, right? So we want to be able to regenerate ATP as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and um, as completely as possible. So ideally, we're looking at how do we facilitate recovery between whether it's if it's American football game from snap to snap, or if it's a rugby match, if we have a stoppage in play, how much are we going to regenerate ATP during that time? How quickly are we going to recover between sessions? How quickly are we going to recover between phases of training? So all these pieces kind of fit together from an energy system development standpoint. Which kind of brings me to our next point. Is like we talk about energy systems, and obviously, like the literature is super clear that very few, whether it's textbooks um, or articles, are going to identify or use terminology other than energy systems. But there are a couple who will refer to these energy systems as pathways, and I think that's really really interesting because it gives us a little bit different conception. Whereas like systems kind of make us think about, the graphic, like 3 lanes of a highway, right? Where all three kind of serve a different purpose. Um, Versus kind of like converging systems where the whole goal is like to regenerate ATP. They just do it at different rates, but they're all active at the same time, right? So we kind of look a little bit different at kind of energy systems, energy pathways, whichever you want to call them. But the 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 big picture is that like we need to realize that they all serve the same purpose for one thing. but then also is that like they're all active at the same time, regardless of which one is predominant. So this is probably review for most of you, but let's go ahead and just knock it out. Like, what are the energy systems and energy pathways? So the my personal favorite is the aerobic system, which obviously, like we know, is oxygen reliant, super high capacity, very long duration, low to moderate intensities, produces very low levels of lactate. Um, it's going to support, your primarily your endurance sports, but also it's going to, what is probably the more overlooked component of the aerobic system is that like it supports recovery of the other two systems, which is kind of like why it's so important. Um, the second system is going to be the anaerobic glycolytic system, or the kind of the lactic system, because it does produce lactate. It's going to be relying on glycogen, low to moderate capacity, low to moderate duration, and it's going to be relatively high intensity, especially if we're looking at gauging intensity from an RPE standpoint uh, rather than heart rate. And it is going to produce high levels of lactate, hydrogen ions, which obviously like that's where kind of the idea of uh, lactate producing a burning feeling, which isn't totally accurate. It's hydrogen ions, but it does produce a good bit of lactate. And then the third system is going to be the anaerobic alactic pathway, which, um, for those of you who know Andy Gallup, and a lot of his research has kind of gone into disproving that this even exists, which I kind of agree with a little bit, but we're not gonna get too far into that. But basically, like a lactic system is going to be relying exclusively on phosphocreatine, super low capacity, super short duration, but highest intensity. So, your Olympic weightlifting, track and field, sprints and throws, those kinds of sports are going to be supported primarily by the alactic system. Um, as far as like the purposes that the systems serve or the pathways serve, so starting with the aerobic system, like first of all, talked a little bit about like how it supports recovery for speed and power sports. And the reason that it does that is that it produces ATP at an extremely high rate. So it produces 36 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, which is massive, right? It takes a little bit of time to do that, but just the sheer volume of ATP it produces kind of demonstrates its value. The glycolytic system is really going to support energy production for kind of like your continuous play sports. So soccer, basketball, hockey, rugby, and it's kind of the power output range for the lactic system is going to be around 30 seconds, whereas the capacity is going to be a minute and a half or so. Um, in terms of regenerating ATP, it's going to be pretty inefficient. It's only going to produce 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose. And as far as the alactic system, like I said in the last slide, it's kind of this is your maximal output system. Um, so this is kind of like what we think of in terms of speed power sports, or kind of like why we classify baseball, softball, and American football as like alactic aerobic sports, because primary output is going to be supported by the alactic system, which again I think is not totally accurate, but for these purposes, it kind of explains it well. It's really, really inefficient though in terms of ATP regeneration. It's only going to produce 1 molecule of ATP per molecule of glucose. Now it's going to do it relatively quickly, but because there's also kind of like a neuromuscular component with the alactic systems, because if you notice, like all of these efforts are maximal, um, even if the alactic system can regenerate ATP at a relatively fast rate, the nervous system can't recover from those outputs as fast, which is kind of why the aerobic system as a recovery mechanism is so important. So specificity, which not a huge fan of that term, and I know a lot of you aren't either, but kind of the default rationale for how conditioning and energy system work has been programmed was that like, oh, well, we just need to mimic the sports work to rest ratio and we should be fine. And the issue with that, if you have kind of figured it out yet is that like it largely ignores the development of the aerobic system. And because if you think about like a sport like volleyball, a rally may only be 6 seconds. Um, During that time, obviously, like there's a whole lot going on. And then between rallies, you may have anywhere from 10 to 12 seconds to like 2 minutes. So the goal shouldn't necessarily be to maximize that 6 second output. It should be to maximize that 20 seconds to 2 minutes that are between outputs so that what you get out of the 6 second output is much more consistent over time. So, in general, like if you do want higher, more consistent outputs, and honestly, like you may even get better quality skill work over time because like fitter athletes are going to be able to perform higher volumes of work in general, whatever that is. It can be technical, tactical, it can be S&C, but ultimately, like the more they can recover, the more they can repeat those um, those technical skills. And in terms of like how we want to think about adaptations because like ultimately a lot of what that last slide was talking about was like performance outcomes, right? And that goes along with following the sports work to rest ratio with kind of a focus more on outcomes than process, which is why like the repeatability component is not as good as it could be by following that approach. So what I like to advocate for is like more of an adaptation driven approach, hence the title of the slide. Um, and that's where maybe like some of these fundamental physiological principles are overlooked. So basically, like the way that I look at it is you've got three kind of layers of adaptations from a physiological standpoint. So you've got your central adaptations, which are obviously going to be primarily in the myocardium or like the muscles of the heart. Um, and then you're going to have two different kinds of peripheral adaptations. So like anything at the heart is going to be central, anything away from the heart is going to be peripheral. And as far as peripheral adaptations, you're going to get some vascular adaptations where these are primarily going to be in the capillary beds, and then you're also going to get some cellular adaptations, which are going to be in the mitochondria, which all of you are repeating that core memory to yourself from middle school or high school biology. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Obviously, not an underrated um, uh, little cellular organism. So as far as central adaptations, all of the changes to the structure of the heart lead to either an increase or decrease in cardiac output, which is basically like on a really simplistic level, stroke volume or the volume of blood per heartbeat times heart rate. So, if you think about your heart rate over the course of how many beats your heart's going to beat in 1 minute, that's essentially what cardiac output is how much blood your heart can get out in a certain period of time, like a minute. Um, and in terms of like the structural changes from a training perspective, so if you look at like this cardiac remodeling diagram, you can kind of throw out the model on the left and the one on the top because those are not going to be adaptations to training, but the one on the bottom and the one on the right are going to be what the adaptations that training is going to elicit. So and the one that I think is more important of the two in terms of uh, left ventricular left ventricular hypertrophy is actually eccentric. So what this does is basically like it creates more space inside the left ventricle, which increases the blood volume that the heart is able to pump. But it's also able to do it at a lower heart rate because it doesn't have to work as hard because it's filling up and stretching and then pushing that blood into the aorta. I will say this though, like in terms of speed and power sports, especially like concentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle is also important because that creates a more forceful contraction of the heart. So, a balance of the two is kind of what leads to the best outcomes because one can affect health and performance, and the other one is going to affect primarily performance. Um, in terms of like how to figure out which is kind of predominant in your athletes, I use kind of the resting heart rate threshold of 55 beats per minute. Usually, if you have an athlete who's in the 55 to 60 range, they've got a little bit more concentric hypertrophy than eccentric. If you've got athletes below 55 beats per minute, which in speed and power sports is going to be pretty rare, they're going to have sufficient eccentric hypertrophy. If you have athletes over 60 beats per minute, these are the athletes that you're going to want to do a lot of low intensity work because they're going to need more eccentric hypertrophy just strictly from a health standpoint, not even factoring in performance. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. So the next layer of adaptations are going to be at the vascular level. And this is going to be an increase in capillary density and volume. So real simplistically, you're looking at a greater number of capillaries per muscle fiber, which is going to facilitate a greater delivery of oxygen or a good higher volume of oxygen in your muscle fibers and cells. And then you're also going to increase capillary volume, which is just like the number of capillaries relative to muscle fibers, whereas density is just the size of the capillaries relative to muscle fibers. In terms of cellular adaptations, primarily, like we said, looking at mitochondria. Same thing here. You're going to see an increase in mitochondrial density, so a greater number of mitochondria per cell. And then you're also going to see an increase in mitochondrial volume, which is basically like an increase in the actual mitochondrial surface area within the cells. So when training at higher intensities, obviously, like you create an acidic environment within the cells, which that's where we get the term lactic acid, even though like it's super inaccurate and does not exist. Um, excuse me. But there's still an acidic environment in the cells, and what happens a lot of times is like it will kill less robust mitochondria. So the more aerobic work that we do, the better and more robust the mitochondria are going to be like within the cells. So kind of moving on to what we think of as like conventional thresholds. So, for those of you who have dabbled in endurance sports or kind of seen some of the research in endurance sports, or maybe even like remember your college ex phys, you remember the idea of like aerobic threshold and anaerobic threshold. And these are still like pretty accurate in terms of like just giving us these like inflection points, right? Where essentially like just they're just biological markers that show us what energy system is predominant and what rate waste products are produced at what intensities. Um, but like they're not totally accurate um, because like again, think about like to those first couple slides, like all energy systems are always going to be active regardless of what intensity we're training at. So kind of saying like, oh, well, once you get past the anaerobic threshold, there's no oxidative support there. Well, that's not accurate. So like what I like to use is lactate thresholds because basically like at any level of intensity, whether it's like super low intensity, even like right now, just sitting here at a desk talking to you guys, like I'm producing between like zero point 0.8 and like 1 millimole of lactate per liter of blood. Now, if I were to get up and like walk across the house, that might spike to like 1 to 1.2. Um, Now, the reason that's important is that like if you look at the graph and you see that LT1, so that's the first lactate threshold. That's two millimoles per liter of blood of lactate. And that's not much higher than like just me sitting here in a chair. So that's kind of a good marker for everything below that first lactate threshold is low intensity. And then moving up towards the right on the graph, you see that LT2. So that's lactate threshold 2, which is 4 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. And again, like the actual lactate doesn't matter because you're not going to be testing athletes with a lactate meter. Although if you do, I'd love to see your results. Um, but the kind of takeaway is that like we need to have relatively clear like intensity delineations if we're not using heart rate. And even if we are using heart rate, like it's still helpful to have like clear thresholds to prescribe intensity. And kind of the most practical way to do that is using what we call like the ventilatory threshold, which these align pretty well with the lactate thresholds, and as well as like the old school kind of aerobic anaerobic thresholds. And basically, what it is it's like using nasal breathing as an autoregulator. So anything like up to that first threshold, whatever we want to call it, should be like easy nasal breathing. Anything between the two thresholds, so that yellow zone 2 right there, that's going to be kind of like forced nasal breathing to the point where like, okay, now like I have to start, maybe I start mouth breathing a little bit, but if I'm able to still nasal breathe, it's really, really uncomfortable. And then that second inflection point would be like ventilatory threshold 2. And that's where, okay, like I have to breathe through my mouth. And again, like they line up actually pretty well with what's going on physiologically. And it's just like a really simple heuristic to use, primarily with running, but like it helps with other modes as well. So, kind of like thinking back onto like the idea of thresholds, regardless of like what kind of model you want to use or like how you want to set what those delineations for zones are, just have an idea in place like of what you would do for low intensity, for moderate intensity, for high intensity, and some sort of heuristic to describe that to your athletes. Again, thinking about not using technology. So as far as like now that we've gotten through a whole lot from a principle standpoint, can talk a little bit about kind of methods. So this is where there's probably an overemphasis or has been an overemphasis in the past, but with that kind of physiological foundation, these methods are going to make a lot more sense. Probably don't need to talk about that one. So this is kind of the, again, obviously looks super similar to the other graphs. And the reason that I like this specifically is because it shows like both VT1, VT2, LT1, LT2, and kind of the delineation between the zones. And this is pretty much like what I use with all of my athletes. And what I do is I assign a handful of methods for each of these three zones and then color code it the same way. And this is kind of what, um, like I have a whole zone-based table, and this is kind of like what that looks like with the different methods, some parameters in terms of work rest, some distances, assuming that you're going to be using running as well as like ranges. So like if you're working with like a women's volleyball team at the collegiate level, you're probably going to look at distance a little bit different than if you're working with like a middle school boys soccer team. Um, but in general, like these parameters are pretty straightforward. Um, and so what I want you guys to think about is like, first of all, if you look at that far left column, all right, what are the target adaptations? And then what do those adaptations yield from a performance standpoint, right? So the lower the intensity, obviously, like those are going to be more of your capacity methods, right? So this is what's going to form the foundation on which you build everything else from an intensification standpoint, which is primarily going to be that red band across the top where your high intensity methods. It's kind of diving down a little bit deeper on kind of like what the methods are. So the zone methods that I like to use the most are cardiac output circuits, aerobic mobility circuits, and then just straight up easy nasal breathing, steady state. Um, for as far as like what those look like. So cardiac output is really super simple. Pick 5 movements, list them out, go 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, work through the movements gradually, take about a minute off, repeat it for 3 to 5 sets. And there's also a sample kind of movement menu. And kind of the common theme between all the movements is that they are all like extensive. So extensive versus intensive. These are all going to be relatively easy. And, for the most part, like an athlete should be able to do these for 1, 2, 3 minutes consecutively. Um, but varying the movements helps us check a lot of boxes that like address things in training that we're probably already doing, or maybe that we don't have time to address. So like crawls, for example, like everybody does some form of crawling. But you can incorporate it into a cardiac output circuit, and now you're kind of like checking that low intensity box. Um, Very similar to cardiac output is one of my favorite methods, which is just was called aerobic mobility. So we pair like some sort of conditioning stimulus. So like you can see in that left column, but on the bike for 1 or 2 minutes, on the rower for a minute or two, run for 30 to 45 seconds, and then work through 3 to 4 different mobility exercises. So like heart rate's going to spike a little bit about in that conditioning segment, and then it's going to gradually come down over the course of those 3 to 4 mobility exercises, right? But also you're checking a bunch of boxes there, and then you go back to the start and you raise that heart rate again. Um, the benefit of like elevating heart rate and then going into the mobility work is that you're going to get a lot more out of the mobility work um, because blood flow is going to be already increasing. So, but in terms of parameters, like you're looking at about, um, 3 to 4 minutes of work and then maybe 1 minute of rest. So, about a 4 to 1 work to rest. And for the most part, like, you want to have an upper body mobility exercise, lower body, total body, and then some sort of like fundamental movement skill. So go back real quick. So these zone two methods, looking at like what we call extensive tempos, and then maximal aerobic speed grids that are performed at 2 different intensities. So we'll talk about extensive tempos first. So for those of you who are familiar with Charlie Francis and have a little bit of a track background, understand kind of what extensive tempos are. Now, the way that I like to do them is a little bit different than like how Charlie liked to prescribe it. Whereas, he was looking at, okay, like track athletes are going to perform these at like 75% of their max speed. That's probably too high for most field and court sports. So like I like to back that down to like a 6 or 7 RPE, which is probably considerably less than like 75% of max speed. Um, and you can see all the time parameters there, but really like with extensive tempos, assuming you have the appropriate pace, and we'll talk about how to prescribe percentage based on maximal aerobic speed, even if you're not necessarily using MAS. But essentially, like these could go from anywhere from 15 seconds on to 2 to 4 minutes, with about a minute to 2 minutes in between reps, and 2 to 3 minutes of interset rest. This is where you're gonna get the bulk of your like off-season volume, and probably the most aerobic development. And here's kind of some sample sessions, both in terms of like different distances, and then you can see that middle column where is velocity over VO2, that's what maximal aerobic speed is for those of you who aren't familiar. Um, Really like anything under about 4 meters per second, I would consider to be extensive, and anything over like 4.5 to 5 meters per second, I would consider intensive. And we'll kind of talk about what that means a little bit later. In terms of those zone three um, methods. So It's not on here, but intensive tempos would be obviously like the opposite, or not necessarily opposite, but the counter to extensive tempos, the complement to extensive tempos. And same thing there, like for Charlie, like these were 95% of max speed. Well, field and course sport athletes are not going to do intensive tempos at that percentage of max speed. Like for most, they're not neurologically developed enough to where that's not a sprint. So like I like to say intensive tempos need to be in somewhere between an 8 and a 9 RPE. Um, Obviously, like because they're a much higher intensity, the work interval is going to be much shorter. You can play around with the rest intervals, but generally, like you want at least a 1 to 3 work to rest, with generous interset rest, so that quality can stay high. There's kind of a couple of uh, intensive sample sessions, and if you look at like the velocity of VO2 there in the middle, you can see that they're both above 5 meters per second. In terms of maximal aerobic speed, which I know, like for those of you who are in soccer and rugby, like very, very popular because it's really, really simple to prescribe. Um, I don't necessarily think it's as accurate as it's purported to be, but for the purposes of another high intensity method, 100 120% MAS Eurofit, which is 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, for prescribed distance based on the athlete's maximal aerobic speed or velocity of VO2 max, um, is another really good option that's really popular with some people I work with. So, covered a bunch of principles, talked about a bunch of methods. Now let's talk about like, all right, like how do we put all this shit together? You've got all this information. What does a program look like? So, my personal philosophy is to base everything on GPS data. Now, even if you don't work in a sport, in a setting where you have access to GPS, like I'm going to give you a lot of like data from different sports, from a handful of like meta analyses, from like the sub elite level. So elite being like Division One, Olympic level, sub elite meaning like competitive high school level. So, and then from there, like we're gonna break down like the total volume of conditioning by extensive, which is going to be under that MAS number, and intensive, which is going to be over that MAS number. Which also like that threshold can be the high speed running. Um, so like for us, we use 5 meters per second as a high speed threshold, and that's for elite international level competitors, obviously. Um, and in terms of like on the female elite athlete side, that's going to be 4.5 meters per second. And then for sub elites, like you're looking at on the male side, 4.5 meters per second. On the female side, about 4 meters per second. Now, you don't necessarily have to know exactly like at what speed like your athletes run for conditioning. It's more just easy to have that as a threshold, so that you can kind of delineate those intensity zones. um, in terms of game volume, so this is from um, the U19 level in American soccer. So if you can see, the different positions are going to run anywhere from 7,000 to 11,000 meters in a game. And the percentage of that that's above that 4.5 meters per second threshold is really, really low, between 7 and 11%. And so, like, the way that I would prescribe volume leading up into, so like, let's say somewhere in mid off season, they need to be getting to at least their game volume strictly in extensive tempo work, or 70% MAS work, within a week, right? That's gonna make sure that we get sufficient aerobic development, and it's gonna help with tissue tolerance. And then as we get closer to preseason, that's where that intensive volume comes into play. where we need to exceed whatever their high speed distance is going to be over the course of a week. And then also like it's going to be a balance of extensive and intensive as we lead up into um, preseason. Basketball, this data was really, really interesting to me because basketball outpaces all other sports. I, I evaluated about 10 different sports to get this data in terms of their high speed running. I mean, you can see that guards spend 35% of a game um, at high speeds or in like high intensity sporting actions, and they also cover 3 miles on a 94-foot long court, which I thought was pretty remarkable. Um, but same thing there, like accumulate extensive volume, but then they got to intensify pretty quickly as well. American football, again, kind of like the primary target audience for the Feed the Cats crew. And they kind of missed the mark here because if you look at like for skills, for example, and honestly, like this is probably pretty conservative because this is data from the high school level. Um, I've seen um, data from Power Four schools where some of their DBs will cover 12,000 yards in a practice. So, that's a ridiculous amount of volume. And they need to have a much bigger aerobic base than you would be led to believe, and able to be able to support that. Here's another interesting one with volleyball, very similar to basketball, where there's a lot of high intensity sporting actions, a much higher volume than you would think. And just the fact that they can cover 3 miles of total distance on a court that's 36 feet long. That's remarkable to me. So it also goes to support the idea that like even though it's primarily like a speed and power sport, um, it's really like they need a much higher volume of extensive work and aerobic work to be able to support all those high intensity actions. So in terms of program design, really like we want to look at three things, and this is where I think the biggest like paradigm shift needs to occur, and that's in dealing with time constraints. So for the most part, like we all kind of deal in 7 day turnarounds, and some of that is realistic, some of it's because it's just practical, but like we actually probably limit ourselves in terms of like what we're able to get out of a training program because we work in 7 day microcycles, right? Well, okay, well if you're at the NCAA level and you're in the off season, that means you've got 8 hours over those 7 days, and really it's more like you got 8 hours over 5 days. So how you distribute that time is really, really critical. Um, and I think like if you think about maybe, okay, well, if I've got 8 hours this week and I've got 8 hours next week, why don't I just extend my microcycle to 14 days? Okay, well, now I've got 16 hours to work with. Okay, now I see how I can get more extensive volume or more aerobic volume during that 16 hours than I do in a week if I constrain myself to those 7 days. Um, but regardless, like you have to factor in time constraints. How much training time do you actually have? And how much of that time can you allocate to conditioning at different points during the year? The second factor, which we just talked about, is like what are the average game volumes for your sport? Even if you don't use GPS, like you just saw the data from four different sports at two different levels, you have an idea of like how much total running volume is in your sport. So like use that to guide your program design, and then look at the intensity distribution. Okay, like what is the percentage of high speed running in your sport, and or the sports that you work with primarily, and then all right, let's say it's like soccer where it's basically 90-10. All right, so about 90% of our volume, like if it's an average week, needs to be extensive and 10% needs to be intensive. Obviously, as we get closer to preseason, you're going to invert that a little bit, which I'll show you like kind of how I do it in terms of our annual plan. It's like we're right in the middle of our off season right now. So if you look at that third block, we're at about 60-40 extensive to intensive. Now, we're a little bit different in that, like right now is we've basically got these 7 weeks to prepare the majority of our team for preseason, which starts in January. The 8 weeks before that, we only had about 10 guys training. So like we have to maximize that 7 week window, which is why the proportions are the way they are. But ultimately, like you can lay out the distribution from a 30,000 foot view the same way. But ultimately, like we want to exceed high speed distance in terms of our intensive volume. And then we want to at least meet our total running volume um, with extensive work. And again, it could be in one session if you've got an hour to work with, just exclusively from conditioning, or maybe it's spread out across 3 sessions in little 20-minute blocks. Like either way, like you can distribute the volume as much as however you need to, basically. Um, do a couple things real quick. So, actually, we'll get back to those. You want to do we do questions right now, Landon?
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Tim, fascinating, and it's amazing the depth of your expertise. So thank you for sharing that with us. And then I'll invite any of our attendees to just come off of mute. They can turn their videos on, and we'd love to get some questions out to Tim. And Tim, as people are coming off of mute, just a question for you. What type of education resources do you offer?
So, right now I'm in the process of building what I'm going to call the coaches conditioning course level one, and that's actually going to launch next month. So, and I have a QR code that I'll put up in a minute that you guys can get on the pre-sale list um, for about $50 off. So, but yeah, it's basically going to be a lot of the information that we just talked about, and a ton more application. So it's about 10 hours of content altogether. So that's the
Excellent.
primary, and then handful of speaking events in the spring.
Okay. And then tell us, just curious about, I know this is a slight departure from our subject, but tell us more about the work that you do at Maverick Performance.
Um, so really, like from a consulting and coaching education standpoint, like a lot of it is auditing programming. So like I see one of my friends, Corey Roy, on here. So Corey works at a high school in Missouri, and what we did is we looked at like how much time he has within a week to train because he's on a set schedule. He knows he's going to see his kids, 4 or 5 days a week for 35 minutes. Like, how do we maximize that time? And so basically, like we looked at like how to periodize like the week to where he's not, kids aren't lifting all 5 days. They're getting some conditioning, they're getting some speed, they're getting the some power work, like, and it's just a well balanced kind of proportion, like training distribution over the course of the week. And then he can go and put those pieces together how he programs with that kind of framework. So that's part of it. I've got about 25 coaches who do some just monthly subscription based conditioning programming. Um, and we have like a little community on my website where we, share training data. We talk about um, obviously a lot of coaching challenges, share resources, those kinds of things. And then eventually I'll have 3 courses on the website, starting with that level one course.
That's fantastic. That's awesome. And then you can type your questions in the chat, or we'd love to have you jump off mute if you'd like to ask Tim a question. Tim, I was curious about uh, a health approach. rather than a performance approach. What do you do personally for conditioning, knowing all that you know? Like, what is a health kind of program?
So that's actually like how the our training group got started is me and my former business partner recruited like 10 or 12 coaches to just do a conditioning program and developed like a little curriculum along with it. But basically it was over the course of 12 weeks we did a month or 4 weeks of like primarily, and it's all heart rate based, so like zone 2 work, just below like 70% of max heart rate, from like 3 hours a week working up to like 6 hours a week. And then we did some kind of tempo work where it was a little bit more interval based, but we also kept like a zone 2 component to that. And then we did kind of an undulating block where we did some like really, really high intensity work, some shorter duration, moderate intensity work, as well as some zone 2. And that's pretty much kind of how I condition myself, because I'm 40 and I'm not getting any younger. So I've been told. So uh, I try to do more low and much more low intensity work than I do high intensity.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Um, and then curious about your use of heart rate monitors with your athletes at the rugby team.
So I've got a couple of like Polar H10s that are just like my personal monitors, and we use them primarily for like return to play and return from concussion. So like if we know like a guy's 48 hours post concussion, but he's cleared for low intensity work, we're going to monitor his heart rate while he, spins on the bike to make sure that he stays under that 70% threshold. Um, Other than that, like every now and then I'll put a monitor in a guy during like a normal training session just so I can see the data to make sure that we're on point. Although this year we're going to a new GPS system that will have heart rate um, within the sensor, so we'll be able to get a better idea of like what that internal load looks like.
See, here's Kristen.
So we're just using stat sports. Um, we thought about doing both, but it's just not financially realistic. So if that answers your question.
Tim, what's the degradation of aerobic capacity if training were to abruptly stop?
So I'm sure like most people on here probably know like Asurin's residuals chart. Uh Supposedly it's 30 days, but to me like that means like 30 days with no activity, no training, nothing. Which I don't know how realistic that would be. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would say like 30 days, you're probably going to lose 10%. Like if you don't have some sort of aerobic stimulus, 90 days, you may be looking at like 30 to 40%. But again, like that's assuming that there's no stimulus whatsoever, which I don't know anybody where that would apply.
There's one question from D. Can you repeat your threshold guidelines? Nasal
Yes.
breathing to mouth breathing.
Um, well, first of all, Curtis Lofton says hello. Second of all, so as far as the threshold guidelines, um, easy or like unforced nasal breathing is up to ventilatory threshold 1, and um, ventilatory threshold 1 to ventilatory threshold 2 would be like a forced nasal breathing or like kind of like nasal inhale, mouth exhale. And then ventilatory threshold 2 would be that top end where okay, like now athletes have to mouth breathe. So is that clear? Cool. Thanks, Daryl.
Tim, do you Have you or do you coach endurance athletes at all?
I've got a couple. I have a, a remote client who is um, a national level like enduro mountain biker, and then I've got um, a client in Germany who is a competitive free diver, which is not like a traditional endurance sport, but yeah, it's definitely an endurance sport.
What does the programming differences look like for an enduro mountain biker versus your rugby athletes?
Um, it's not all that much different because the principles are relatively the same. For like so like for my client Toby, like the longest duration hard effort that he's going to see is about a minute and a half, which is pretty much like the longest like ball and play time that we'll see in rugby. So from an intensity standpoint, they're both very, very high intensity efforts during those times, but then they're still like supported um, by aerobic capacity for recovery.
Interesting. Just a couple of minutes left, Tim. Again, a huge thank you to you for taking time out of your schedule and away from your family. So we appreciate that. And we'd love to get some either contact information or some ways that we can get more information on your courses.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me. Like this was awesome. Great turnout. So I'm gonna share my screen again. I've got like three QR codes. One is for um the course pre-sale list. Um, so if you guys want to snap a picture of that, feel free. Um, and then the second, so I've got like a five-part email course that kind of extrapolates on some of the stuff that I talked about tonight. If anyone's interested in that, it's good information. And then we're hosting a team sport conditioning summit here in New Orleans on Saturday, January 11th, which is the day after NSCA Coaches Conference. It's myself and Dr. Gareth Sanford. We'll be hosting that. So all the information is in that link. So does anybody need to see any of those again? And as far as contact info, so on the platform that is burning down currently, Twitter, I'm at Tim Kettenring. And then on Instagram, I'm at Tim Kettenring 13. And then my email is just tim at maverickhumanperformance.com.
That's fantastic. Well, again, Tim, thank you so much. This has been really informative. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for showing up. Awesome to see
For sure.
so many familiar faces.
Yeah, thank you for bringing them all in, Tim. Have a good evening.
You guys as well.
All right, bye.
Bye.